Welcome.
You're now listening to Dirty Feet.
Bonjour, oui, vous êtes sur les ondes des pieds sales, a.k.a.
Dirty Feet podcast on No More Radio.
And hosted by
Joanie Farran,
JD Papillon,
Allison Burns. Stay tuned, we're going to move you. We have a very special 40th episode of Dirty Feet here. We're actually celebrating not only our 40th episode, but also the 80th year of life for Elizabeth Langley, who just celebrated her 80th birthday and has so graciously agreed to join us in studio to talk about her incredible career and hopefully some insights into this creative mind. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Now, if you haven't heard the name Elizabeth Langley before, we'll forgive that and we'll inform you about Elizabeth herself. She was born in Australia, as you may be able to tell by her accent, her lovely accent, and she's spent, can I say, 60 years performing and dancing?
Oh, about that.
About that, amazing. And she also founded the contemporary dance department here at Concordia in Montreal, and so many more things. Currently, you're continuing to work as a dramaturge and a mentor. Are you also still creating and dancing?
I'm creating, but I don't call it dancing anymore in my performance work, because when people would ask me, are you still dancing, Elizabeth? And I would say yes, a strange expression would pass over their faces. So now I call it physical theater. And but it's that kind of physical theater that can only be done by a dancer. But I now use text and whatever I like.
Wonderful. Can we talk about your early career? Did you start your training in Australia?
Well, I think I started to train myself before I started to be publicly trained in a studio. I was the fourth child of a very creative bazaar for Australian children. And by the time I came along, my parents were very tired, and we were literally allowed to create in any way we liked. It didn't matter whether it made noise or it smelled bad or we dug up the garden or whatever. So my thing, and I didn't even know the word improvisation, and I definitely couldn't have spelt it. My thing was to go into the front room and to put on music and to do my thing, which was literally interpreting the music with my body. And I started doing that seriously a few hours every day at about the age of 7. And, of course, my father was a champion social dancer, and my aunts, my absolutely renegade aunts, had performed in vaudeville in Australia when it was like only done by scarlet women. So I come from a pretty wild background. So I did my thing for many years, every day. And then one lucky day in my life, my brother came home with a girlfriend, and she said to me, "Oh, I go to a studio where they do that." Now, the idea that there was a group of people somewhere who were improvising together just threw me into a tailspin. So my mother took me to the studio, and I remember everything I saw in that first class. Exercises, some bar work, some floor work, some crossing the floor, and improvisation with this group of people. So within about, I think, a month, I was there like every day. And they became my family. And I started teaching at that particular studio in 1953. My apprenticeship went from 1953 to 1960. And, you know, people complain these days about having to teach a few classes a week. My apprenticeship for 7 years was to teach 45 classes a week, traveling 250 miles, choreographing, sewing my own costumes, folding programs, cleaning toilets, hammering nails in on stage floors. And that was my apprenticeship. And it made me tough. It also made me determined to go on. So do you want the next chapter now?
Yes, please.
Well, I have miraculous things happening in my life. In 1960, I fortunately met the musicians that were touring Australia with Harry Belafonte. And one of them and I became very connected, we'll say that in inverted commas. So eventually, Harry Belafonte sponsored me to New York because I wasn't a rich person, and that was the only way I could get a visa. So I ended up in New York with a student visa with my musician lover and at the Martha Graham School of Dance. So that was another miraculous thing that happened to me. I am a fortunate person. My life goes on from one fortunate thing to another. So I was there for 5 years, and then instead of going back to Australia, I drifted north, and we all know what's north of the United States. And I ended up, first of all, in Ottawa, where it seemed like Ottawa was waiting for me, because there were lots of people like bored in Ottawa, and you can get bored in Ottawa, we all know that. And so I really was able to do everything. I did experimental children's theater, I taught, I developed a thing called Gymnasium Theater, where we performed theater in gymnasiums, and I did marry there, and I did divorce there, and I had a baby there. And then came my next fortunate moment. I got a call from Concordia University, and someone had recommended me to establish the dance degree program. Now, I have never applied for a job in my whole life. People have always called me and said, "Do you want this job?" And this was just another fortunate thing that happened. So my daughter and I moved to Montreal, and there I was at Concordia for nearly 20 years. And designing the contemporary dance degree program, like designing a job and giving it to yourself, that is the best thing that could happen in the world. So, and the department has gone on. You know, Michael Montanero inherited my job, and he was exactly the right person. Retirement was perfect for me, and the rest is now my daily life.
Incredible. Do you have any insight into the inspiration for the creation of the department and why you got that invitation to come in?
Well, somebody in the visual art department, the dean asked her if she knew anybody in Canada who could create a degree program. Now, he was very familiar with contemporary dance and art throughout Canada. And he, at that point, this was 1979, he decided that Canada had as good dancers as anywhere in the world, but he felt that the choreography was not the strong Canadian creative venue. So he wanted to create a department that dominated in creation and interpretation and choreography. Well, he asked this woman who had been my student, did she know anybody who would do that? And she said, "There's one person in Canada." That's such a compliment. One person in Canada who could do it, and it was me. So that was pretty lucky for me.
I don't know if you know, but all three of us, JD, Allison, and I, did graduate from the dance program at
did?
Concordia.
Oh,
Yes,
you
we did.
did.
So we chose to go there because we were called, I guess, by this creativity that the program offers, by these ways of discovering what's our own signature, I guess. How do we move, and how can dance make us move, I guess.
Yes.
So first off, thank you, I guess, for starting this program that, we are so fond of.
Thank you.
And so the first few years, how was it to get dancers to join the program? How did it evolve, I guess?
Well, again, it was a bit like a repeat of what happened in Ottawa. It seemed like there were a lot of people in Montreal at that time who would have liked to have been in a program like that if it existed. And something very interesting I discovered in Quebec was that there male dance in the villages through Quebec. Dance for men is an accepted thing, whereas in Ontario it's not an accepted thing. So I had a lot of male students who came in whose fathers had been the champion step dancers in their village or the fiddle player or whatever. So I don't think I had any trouble. I think just people came in as soon as the word went out. I did work in the theater department for the first year because there was no dance department and they wanted to put me to work. So the word was going out in the community. And there were other dance programs being established at that time. One was at UQAM and one was at the University of Montreal. But they were very different kinds of programs. And the dean said to me right from the beginning, do not get bigger. Stay small. Take 20 students and do not take any more. Because he really felt that it would call to people right across Canada to come to Montreal into the program, and that you cannot deal with the creativity of the individual student if you have 70 students, because you don't even know their names usually. So I think that was a really wise move on his part. But no, people came in, and a lot of them, those people in the first 7 years, a lot of them came to my birthday party just recently, which was so nice. Right. But tell me about your experience.
Ooh, okay. Well, me and Alison were in the same year. We met there in 2005.
Yeah.
And overall, it's been excellent. We had Michael Montanaro as a teacher, and we were talking about him earlier. Actually, he really has taught us to really open our minds, think outside the box. Not try to come with an idea that's going to blow everybody's minds away, just try to keep it simple, keep it authentic, and really research it and move it, I guess, Alison, is a good way to describe it, what we've done for 3 years of intense improvisation and exploration.
For sure. I think the biggest takeaway I have in way of describing it to people who aren't familiar with the program is because of the creative process classes, which follow you through all 3 years, especially coming into the program young like I did, it kind of taught me a bit more about who I was and how I think and how I problem solve. And I think that's valuable on all sorts of levels, not just for creativity, but also, for life.
Some parents used to come into my office looking gruff and say, well, what can my child do with this degree program? Right. This was when we were at Loyola, not during the first few years, but when we were at Loyola. And I would, and what jobs can they get? So I'd say, well, I promise them no jobs, right? But I'll tell you what your child shall graduate with: a healthier body, more knowledge of themselves, and they will be strong and they will know how to work. Because I think dancers have to know how to work. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't know how to work, it doesn't work.
How much confidence did you have coming into it that you could teach someone creativity? And was that the goal at the beginning?
Well, I had already taught creativity since 53, and that was 79. So I had had a lot of experience with adults and children. And teaching children teaches you a great deal. And I had experimented, especially in Ottawa, I'd experimented with new methods of generating creativity in people. And it was interesting because most of the children I taught in Ottawa came from parents who were in the political system. And a lot of them had moved from Saskatchewan when the leftist party went out of power. So these children came from very enriched backgrounds, and eventually they taught their own classes. And I think I learned with them to understand when to move forward and when to move out. And I think this is one of the important things when you're teaching creativity. When do you support, and when do you pull the supports out and let the student find out how to support themselves? And I think that's the same in parenting with your own children. Like, when do you move in and take care of them, and when do you move out and let them become strong as individuals? It's a very delicate line that a creative teacher walks, because you mustn't become involved in the process of the student either, because then you become possessive, and then you start to fulfill your own creativity through your students, and that is also very bad. Teachers must have their own creative lives to free them up so that that possessiveness does not happen. It takes a lot of concentration, I tell you, I may have looked very relaxed, but my eyes were always roaming the studio and watching and learning about people, not about their private lives. I didn't want to know about their private lives because that would color how I would treat them, with more compassion or less compassion. But just the studio life of the student. I'll tell you, you mentioned Michael Montanaro. After I'd left the department for 2 years, I went back to the end of the year program, and we went out for a beer. And I told him I was so glad he inherited my job, because he and I share some qualities. First of all, we have sense of humor, and that is the most important thing in life for me. He's also over-generous to students, and he's also very perceptive. But he had one quality or one area of information, more likely, that I didn't have. And I felt that it was time for me to retire from the department, because the students needed a person like Montanaro to take them into tech theater. Because I come from traditional theater, black box traditional theater. And today students need to create in all the contemporary medium choices that are now available. Maybe I was just too tired to educate myself into so that I could be what the students needed. But he had that. He came from tech theater, etc., etc. So I think I'm also fortunate that Michael inherited my job, because it's rolled on, as you said, as you described how he was for you. I think he was the right person. But I'd like to talk to Sylvie about Sylvie Panay-Raymond for a while, because I taught Sylvie when she was 16 years old in Ottawa. She was my student. Then she went to Europe for a while, and I came to Montreal, and I was sitting in my office in the Victoria School, and I was trying to put my faculty together for the coming year. And I just needed one more person. And this is another fortunate. I have so many fortunate moments. This was so fortunate because I felt there was somebody standing in the door of my office. So I looked like that, and it was Sylvie Panay-Raymond leaning against the door jamb. And I just said to her, "Hey, Sylvie, want a job?" And she was my teacher. So she became my part-time faculty member. And then, of course, she became a full-time faculty person. And I was her chair, and she was my footstool, as I call it. And then she became the chair, and I became her footstool. And she and I have had a wonderful working relationship. It's been... We won't even talk about how many years it's been now. But I think Sylvie Panay-Raymond is one of the most intelligent people in the dance community of Canada. I think she is so totally smart and demanding, very different from me, very different from Michael, but also very important to the department.
You brought up briefly your own creative life that has to coincide with your teaching. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it seems like my life is in 3/3 at this point, because until I left Australia in 1960, my creative life as a choreographer and as a performer and as an interpreter was saturated. Well, of course, at the Graham School, the only creativity that's respected is the creativity of Martha Graham. And I didn't even tell anybody at the Graham School that I could improvise, because improvisation was like a dirty word. It was things that nursery school children did, right? But not serious adults. Although it was the dance revolution in the 60s, there was Judson Church, etc., that was going on. But at the Graham School, you didn't talk about improvising. But the creative spirit goes on. It has to come out. So during those years, I wrote poetry, and some was published, and that was kind of exciting. Well, then when I came to Canada, to Ottawa, my creation desires were fulfilled by my students. And I did evolve works for them to perform that were very loosely structured. So I didn't feel during that time that my creativity paid a price for just teaching, because I taught at Carleton University, Ottawa University, and then I had my own practice. So I was also doing a lot of teaching. But I never felt deprived. Well, then when I came to Montreal, again, I can be very fulfilled by other people's creativity. But again, I had a lot of input into the group works and the end of semester performance works we did. So that was fine with me. And also, I was a single mother at that point, so my life was pretty crowded with things. Well, I had one sabbatical and went back to Australia and taught at the equivalent of the National Theatre School there. And did some clowning. I had studied clowning in New York. Did some clowning in my hometown, which was kind of fun. But then I got a second sabbatical, and I decided to take a 2-year sabbatical, because you can have a one-year sabbatical on 2/3 of your salary, or a 2-year sabbatical on bag lady money. And I thought, this will be a rehearsal for retirement. This will be my rehearsal for the major show down the road. So I took my 2-year. Finished research in Montreal, and then I'd been accepted at the School for New Dance Development in Amsterdam. And when I was accepted there, because I think I was the oldest person they'd ever had, I must admit when they accepted me, I cried, because their program was the closest to the program that I designed at Concordia in the whole world, right? I knew that. And Amsterdam is such a wonderful city. So I had a year there as a student. I did my own training in the morning, and I had 6 hours of improvisation every day in 3 classes with people from 13 countries of the world. Well, fortunate again, right? And also every Friday there you could perform. So I got a lot of opportunities to perform all kinds of works in the basement, in the studios, whatever. And maybe it sounds strangely fortunate, but while I was there, Concordia offered me early retirement. And I had already suffered some stress, some serious stress from running that department. And my daughter pleaded with me. She said, "Please retire, Mom, because you're either going to retire or die at your desk, right, trying to keep things going, because budgets had been cut." And the first 7 years when I was there, I had no budget at all. I used to pick up elastic bands on the street that the postman's dropped. But so I decided to retire, and to retire to my own creative life. I heard about a festival in a 3,000-year-old village in Turkey. I didn't even know where Turkey was, frankly. That's terrible. My geography is not very good. But it was physical theater and contemporary dance in this 3,000-year-old village. And there was no budget. I was used to no budget. But people would go and live in this little hotel on the beach and prepare site-specific works in this 3,000-year-old village. And this village, it's called Assos, and it's south of Troy. Could you imagine being south of Troy in your life? I never thought that would happen. So I went to this festival, and it was an amazing experience in lots of ways. But, there are Australians all over the world. And in the dining room, we used to table hop for meals. And somebody said to me, where do you come from? I said, well, originally I come from Australia. Oh, there's other Australians here. There were like 40 of us. And I thought, oh, bugger. Everywhere I go, there are Australians. And sometimes Australians don't like me, and sometimes I don't like them. I've been gone a long time. Anyhow, eventually I thought, I'll go and have breakfast with the Aussies, right? Well, I discovered these 2 totally amazing people, a guy and his partner, and they were there doing duet work. So, and I watched out of the corner of my eye the things that the man was creating in this center where all our equipment was and our props and everything. And he was creating the most amazing things. And I said to myself, I want to work with these people, but it's not my way to go and say to people, hey, I want to work with you, right? But one day Mary said to me, do you want to work with us? So I did my solo on some 2,500-year-old ruin rocks that had collapsed on a hillside. They did their duet, and then we did a trio work together in a dried-out riverbed. That was very exciting.
Well, I'm curious because I get the impression that these days you're focused on solo work and one-woman shows, and I'm wondering if that is that where your interest lies at the moment? Is it out of ease of access to yourself, or what makes you go in that direction? Or am I not on target? Do you work a lot with other people?
You're pretty on target.
Yeah?
Well, it all comes out of that Turkey experience, because I came back to... this is another long story. Are you ready for another long story?
Oh, yeah.
At one stage in my life, I bought a block of land on a Fiji island. Because I couldn't afford a block of land in Australia, and so I bought a block of land on a Fiji island. And one day, I went to a library when I was just visiting there and conned the librarian to let me take out a book to take to the beach with me. And it was not the kind of book you take to the beach, because it was like a big book like that. And it was about amazing Australian writers since the beginning of white history in Australia. So I'm sitting on the beach, and I'm turning the pages, and I'm saying, oh, yes, I've read that, and I know that author. And then I turned the page, and there was this little tiny black and white photograph, really like just a proof photograph of a woman, and it was even out of focus. But she's somehow looking at me. So I looked down, and what is her name? Her name is Eve Langley. So here's Elizabeth Langley sitting on a beach in Fiji looking at a photograph of Eve Langley. So I read about her. I read her story, which is like the most dramatic life story you can possibly imagine. And then I read a piece of her writing. So I Xeroxed these couple of pages out of this book, and they'd been in my file for about 10 years. And when you go through, you create a file, and you go, garbage, 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 no, keep, garbage, go. Well, I'd kept this for 10 years. So I'm sitting in Montreal, and I think, I need to do a one-woman show, and I need a director. And I need to do a work about this woman. And the director I need is that man that I met in Turkey. So I phoned him up. And he's now been my director for the last 12 years. So I spent time in Montreal, time in Australia, working with this totally amazing man. And another fortunate thing about working with him, he's not interested in the dancer in me. He's interested in the performer in me. And I started working with him when I was about 67. At 67, he made me the best performer I have ever been in my life. Now, what a gift. Because usually for dancers, we're finished. If we're 50, we're usually, retired. And here I am at 67, performing my one-woman show and really doing the best work. And I premiered it in Melbourne. I performed it in Sydney at the Mardi Gras Theatre Festival, and I also performed it in Montreal. And I'm still working with him, and we're now working on another one-woman show.
There's a little excerpt of Light Years, the video, on your site, and in it you say something to the effect of the fear in creation is that you think that you know yourself so well, and you have confidence in that, and then something new comes out, and you discover a new part of yourself.
I'm still discovering new parts of myself, and I think I will do it until the day I croak, right? But I used to teach students, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to teach you two guys. That would have been so nice. But I used to teach them to be watchful of the terror of creation, because I would watch students. And you, especially when you're young, you think, oh, I now know who I am, right? And then something comes out of you that you've never imagined. And it's very scary for people. And I've watched people literally cringe and retreat from that lack of knowledge of the self. But the self never finishes. The self evolves until your last breath. And I said to them, when that terror happens, when you're creating, just say to yourself, oh, this is the terror that Elizabeth told me about, and just go on and discover new things about yourself.
Perhaps we can talk about your work as a dramaturge as well. And is that an extension of your interest in teaching, or is that something apart? What is the relationship there between the two?
Well, I just learned the word recently. But I think what I did at Concordia in the choreography classes was dramaturging. It's like hands off the creative process of the person. Assist them to be the best they can be and create what they want to create and express what they want to express. So I think all those near 20 years I was at Concordia, I was dramaturging. Because you must not interfere, and you must not help. Some students used to say to me, this work wasn't good, and you should have helped me make it good. I said, that's not my job. Also, failure is a very important part of learning, and sometimes you learn more from failure than you do from success. Because success is like you just kind of pat yourself and feel good. But in failure, you have to go and examine why this didn't work. So it's not the dramaturge's job, or I don't think, and lots of people would disagree with me and argue with me, but it's not my job to enter into the process. My job as a dramaturge is on product, and to perhaps ask questions of the creator that the creator is not asking themselves, but not to give them the answers. The answers they have to find themselves.
I imagine that you pick and choose who you work with in this context. And how do you do that? Do you look for the work that interests you or the artist that you get along with?
Well, you have to have some kind of rapport, because it's also a very sensitive situation in the studio. Well, I'll talk about Tomomi. Do you know Tomomi here?
Tomomi Morimoto, I think.
Denise Fujiwara in Toronto wanted me to mentor her in Montreal. And I said, I sent her some emails, and I said, I won't agree to do this. Although Denise Fujiwara is so wise, she must have known. But I said, I won't agree to do this unless we meet. And we both decide that there's an opportunity for a working relationship. So we met at that wonderful chocolate place on St. Denis that's closed. How terrible. But we met there, and over chocolates and hot chocolate and coffee and whatever, we talked for a couple of hours. And we didn't talk about her work or my work. We just talked about being people, right? Because it's the people. The artist is the extra coating, but it's the person that I have to work with. So after a lot of chocolate and a lot of caffeine buzz, we decided that we could go into the studio and at least test in the studio whether we could work together. And we did that. Well, it was a wonderful, wonderful relationship. After she showed me her work in its early stages, I must admit I had to go away and think, how can I help this woman? Because, I've done a lot of Butoh in my life, and I've worked with a lot of Butoh people, and I've been to a lot of Butoh festivals and whatever. And her work has a shadow of Butoh on it, but not really, because she comes from martial arts and she comes from classical ballet and whatever. But every day in the studio with her, I learned something. And I think that's also very important, because, people are of the impression that I have a huge ego. And I do have one, because to be a performer, you have to have one. But unless I'm teaching and learning, I am not teaching well. If I can't provoke you to do something that stretches my knowledge, I am not doing you the duty that I should be doing to you. Every day in the studio with her, I learn something. And her partner, or her husband, Matthew, he told me after the process was over, Tomomi always came home and said, yes, like that. So I went home saying yes, and she went home saying yes. And it was a wonderful relationship. But that was really chosen. We chose one another. And it's the same with Sasha Zarif, the performer from Toronto. We talked a long time together, and then we went into the studio, and I watched him also wondering how I could help this man, because he has such a particular way of expressing himself. But I found a way to do that too. But it's hands off, eyes on, and hands off to be a good dramaturge, I think.
Do you find the opportunity to give your opinion on work in terms of like going to see a piece, or do you try and stay neutral, or do you have to, because of what am I trying to say? Sometimes I feel very oversaturated with information that I have about dance and about choreography, that to form a simple opinion about a work and just say, I liked it, I didn't like it, is very difficult, because I see merits and I see faults and I see what could be, etc., etc. Yeah. Do you find yourself still able to judge work when it's appropriate, even if not to express that to anyone, but just for yourself, to have a taste?
Well, as a young professional, I can understand how you use performance to develop your critical sense and your personal taste. And those are two things that you have to keep separate, right? And not let them all get mixed up together. And you'll be able to do that later on. It may be difficult now because the liking and the information that you have about your craft gets kind of confused. But whenever I go and sit in a theater, or when I see somebody's work in the studio for the first time, I empty myself out. Do not be judgmental. I also used to teach judgmental is made up of two words, to judge and to be mental. Because you never judge people's work because you don't know where they're coming from, etc., etc., etc. And we're all in process.
Once it has reached the stage and once it's kind of up there for the public and you're not invited in as part of the process but rather as a spectator to the work, do you find then that you can form opinions and have tastes?
No, I go to that zone of emptiness, and the thing that I find most interesting is that I'm sitting in amongst the audience and I want to read the audience because that's also what the work is communicating is in the environment in which I am sitting. And I think that's also part of my job. But I get very nervous. I get very tense. My shoulders are way up like that, because it's easier to perform than it is to have worked with a performer and sit in the audience, right? And it's difficult. But I once did an experimental work here. I'll have to tell you about a failure. I decided to. I was into 4-minute works, and I decided on an experiment. I'm always experimenting, and of course that's always dangerous. And it was here at 303. I decided to, on some pieces of costume, but not on how it was going to come together or how I was going to be made up. And I decided not to look in the mirror before I went to perform. And I learned so much that night. But students in the audience were offered a free beer to go out with me afterwards and have a free beer, and none of them stayed back. That's how bad the work was. No one wanted to face me, even for a free beer. So that is an incredible moment. But it was bad. And it didn't work at all. It totally failed. Because I didn't realize that when you put on your costume and your makeup, and you go into a performance space, the audience doesn't know what you're going to do. You know that. But you know what you look like, and you know what they're seeing, right? Even if it's just how you have dressed yourself. But in 4 minutes, I could not get out from underneath not knowing what I looked like and get across that empty space between me and the audience and connect with them. I didn't connect at all. But it was the most amazing experience, and I would never know how important it is to look at yourself in the mirror before you go perform. So I learned a lot that day, and I learned a lot that there can be a limit to free beer.
So you've worked in the Netherlands and Finland and Cuba and China and Australia and all over.
Yes, I have.
And Montreal is decidedly your home base.
The 3 important cities in my life are Melbourne, Manhattan, and Montreal. These are my first And I do have a condo here, and I have lived here since 1979, and I love Montreal. There are self-conscious cities and unself-conscious cities in the world. And Ottawa, I found, was self-conscious. Montreal is a non-self-conscious city. And the spirit here is so good. I think there are more people living in Montreal who love Montreal. And I think that's how the spirit of a city is generated. And you can just walk down the street here. You can see how comfortable people are. And people wear all kinds of clothes and they do all kinds of things. And, yesterday there's a man walking down Saint Laurent with a snake around his neck. And this morning I saw a cross-dresser in my drugstore up here. That was the most beautiful cross-dresser I have ever seen in my life. Just absolutely beautiful. Now that's within 2 days on the plateau. But I may lose fans now, but if you live in Canada, I think you have to live in Montreal because, to me, it is the city. And if you live in Montreal, you have to live on the plateau because the plateau is the best of the best of the best. So a piece of my heart is always here.
Amazing. I'm with you there. I live in the plateau as well. I love it. Can you reflect, I know it's a big question, but in broad strokes perhaps, the evolution of the dance community from when you first arrived in Montreal to now?
Another thing that I'm usually doing, I'm usually going in one direction when a lot of people are going in the other direction. And when I came to Montreal, there was the big exodus. A lot of the Jewish community left because of what looked like the future political situation here, and a lot of French Canadians left. Matter of fact, we all know that there's a huge French Canadian community in Florida that left in the late 70s. So I'm coming in, they're going out. And before, except for the very experimenting small group of people in Quebec who were exploring the individual creative body, he had been dominated by classical ballet, which the Catholic Church seems to accept, and then jazz, which is the rebels who don't want to do classical ballet. So there was a huge jazz and classical ballet community here. And then before the end of the 70s, a very small renegade group of people. But then the degree programs started to arrive. And I think politically at that point, or creatively and politically, people were asking themselves, who am I? And I think that's what happened with the Exodus. I think people were asking themselves, am I a Quebecois, or am I a French Canadian, or am I an English Canadian, or am I Jewish? And I can say that because I'm part Jewish. And do I really want to live here? Because people were asking a lot of personal questions. And soon as people ask personal questions, you go to personal creativity. And I felt that was a huge blossoming that happened here in those end of the 70s and the early 80s. It was, look, when I came here, I went to the Centaur Theatre to a contemporary dance festival there. And it was as though the festival had been designed for me. Oh, what an ego trip. Because every modern and contemporary dance group were performing there in this festival. And I saw everything that was going on in the city. It was so exciting. There were so many groups that had developed and were performing, all kinds of groups. So that was very exciting. And then, of course, when the university education of dances happens, then you get an evolution in the community. And you'll find Canadian dancers from here and other parts of Canada in dance companies all over the world now. It's like Australian dancers are in companies. You look at the names of foreign companies and you can see all the nationalities. So dance here has blossomed incredibly, I think, and has a particular personality. I think, I've done a lot of work in Toronto, and a Toronto dance community has a totally different creative voice to the Montreal voice. Totally, totally different. And in some cases, they don't understand one another.
Could we perhaps get a perspective on your other two the other two cities that have stolen your heart, and for what reasons?
Well, Melbourne is, of course, the city where I was born and where I danced until 1960. But at that stage, Sydney was the swinging city, and Melbourne was the artistic city, but much more conservative. And as students, we would go to Sydney to do naughty things that we didn't want relatives to know about, because it was kind of the wild city where you went to be wild and anonymous and whatever. But now Melbourne has become, its pulse has definitely speeded up. It has also a lot of dance schools there, and music is very strong there. It has the second largest Greek population of any city in the world after Athens. A huge Italian population, huge, immense Greek population, and also a spattering of all other nations. And also a lot of African people there, and also a lot of Asian people there. So the city has become very different from the city that I was brought up in. Because in the 50s, I was dating one of the two coloured people that were in Melbourne, and we could not be seen in the street together at that point because racism was so what it was. But now it's like intermarriage, and so my city has grown up into the 21st century, and I'm very proud of it. And I'll tell you a little story that showed me how Australia had changed. I was sitting in a food court, and these two women came in, and they were obviously in Melbourne from the day from some country centre. They all had the same kind of block heel shoes, lace up, not too high, the same very heavy stockings, the same floral dresses. Their hair had been set at the same hairdressers. They had little hats on, little plastic handbags. And they're walking towards me, and I'm looking at them thinking, now these are two women that have come from some country town for a day in Melbourne. And one of them, and I'm going to use my Australian accent, my pure Australian accent now, and one of them turns to the other one and says, Mabel, yes, Flo, what kind of sushi are we going to have today? Well, that to me was the epitome of Australia grown up. That these women knew that sushi existed even was a miracle, and that they'd had it before, and then they were going to choose from sushi, from different kinds. Like it was a great moment for me. There are those moments that tell you, it's like cognac. You know, life is like beer, and then there are moments that are like cognac. That was a cognac moment for me.
Amazing. And that final M, Manhattan.
Well, Manhattan changed my life. You know, I was totally ignorant of any other culture, and I toured a lot with Harry Belafonte Company. So, and I went in New York and in Hollywood at that level. So I met a lot of very interesting people. And also it was the time of the Black March on Washington, the riots in Harlem, the assassination of Kennedy. Like in Australia as a student, you know, if we hadn't been fined for not voting, who would come off the beach or out of the dance studio in Australia to go and vote? Like, it was kind of a crazy idea. So I was politically totally ignorant and thrown into this terribly viable and nervous situation. So that was very exciting for me. And one of the dancers at the Martha Graham School I became friends with. And I was her first white friend, and she was my first black friend. And that was a whole education for me. And we stayed friends for many years until she sadly died. But every day in Manhattan was just like it was a huge resource of what I saw in the streets. You know, people eating my garbage, that was something that as an Australian I could never have imagined. And the poverty and the anger and the riches and it was just like, I think everybody should go to New York once in their life. You should go to Paris, you should go to Venice, you should go to Cuba, you should go to Manhattan, just once in your life, because they have something to teach you about the planet. But I don't want to live there anymore. Like 5 years was enough. I hear it's better now, but I don't want to know that it's better or worse. But just, I had lived on visual art in books. Well, I went to New York to the galleries and I saw it live. It was just totally, totally amazing. The museums there, the galleries, the concerts, the whatever, everything was just amazing. And Montreal, beautiful, beautiful Montreal. I will always love Montreal.
I'd like to hear a bit about what the Montreal dance scene was like when you first got here, when the contemporary dance scene started emerging in Montreal. Like, what was that creative vibe like?
Well, first of all, I have to apologize for my memory because, and this is for names, because my daughter and I have worked out that I have taught 6,000 to 7,000 people in my life, and I tried to always remember their names. And if I was teaching a children's class and I gave a child the wrong name, I would make sure that by the end of the class I had named every child with the wrong name so that it was democratic. But now, when you called me this morning on the phone, I had trouble remembering your name because the gray matter in my brain that has held all these names is tired. And I don't want to talk about being senile or anything, but some people say to me, I'm a young person, I can't remember people's names. But if you have white hair like I do and you can't remember somebody's name, a chill goes through the room these days because they think you're coming apart at the seams. So I can't really name all the companies that I saw performing when I first came here because my memory doesn't recall names anymore. But there were so many people, companies and individual people here, who were expressing what they personally wanted to express. And it was just rich. The whole community here was dance rich. And it had come out of studios, because it wasn't coming out of university programs because they weren't established. So it was literally coming out of teachers that were heading up studios, that were developing dancers who were forming companies that were expressing what they wanted to express. And that definitely came out of the political shift here. And I think it's still that political shift and that creativity is still happening here. And how many years is it now? I've lost count. The 80s, the 90s, the 10s. Yeah, it's over 30 years. I think it's still rolling here, and I think it is still rich. But that was like the birthdays, those late 70s, early 80s here. And when you go into having people graduating like you both did from university programs, that brings a different kind of dynamic. I think there are two kind of choreographers, if I may touch on this subject. There are choreographers who should be choreographers, and there are choreographers who should not be choreographers. And I think you have sat in theaters and seen works by both those kinds of people. Some people are under the impression that just because they have been an interpreter in choreographers' work, that teaches them how to be a choreographer. But I don't believe in that. Some people have genius in their genial qualities in their brain that let them do that. But a lot of people do not. There are periods in history where the territory of creation is so fresh that the non-educated choreographer has place. But then there's a part in history where people are graduating with choreographic knowledge, and that takes the whole of the community to another level. And also, interpreters come out of university education with different skills to interpret. Because when I was growing up, nobody taught me how to be an interpreter. But out of university programs, you learn and you get to perform in so many people's choreography. So when you graduate, you have advanced information about how to interpret different people's works. So the whole community goes to another level altogether. But I think I was somewhere once at a conference, and there were two people there debating that choreography can be taught and choreography can't be taught. And these were very knowledgeable people, and they both had great arguments. But I must admit, I think the information, the ingredients for choreography can be taught. Choreographing cannot be taught, but the elements and the ingredient can be taught. And I think the learning just makes alive the potential and the possibilities in your brain. Would you agree with me on that?
I wouldn't know how to say it. I don't know how to answer that.
You don't know how to answer that?
No.
Well, maybe next year you'll be able to answer it.
Maybe.
Maybe it's
something
too
I need
soon.
to think about.
Yes.
A lot. Yeah.
Yeah. But the most important thing is that the ingredients does not dominate you when you go into the studio to create. That's got to be there by osmosis. Because the dominant thing in the studio is the creation of a movement in your body. And not thinking, how am I using space, and how am I using time, and what about my phrasing, and what about my pulse beat, etc., etc. Because that's a killer.
Well, I guess it's picking one at least to work on, isn't it? Again, it's something that Michael said many years ago that I said earlier.
I would disagree with you. I would just throw you into the pool.
Yeah.
Yes. Just throw you into the studio. But because experimenting and choreographing a theater piece is also a whole different thing. And I have to admit that right now I'm working in duet with Peter Ryan, and I have a rehearsal with him soon today. So this whole talk about me and my one-woman show has just been perhaps confused slightly, because out of my birthday party, I danced with Peter Ryan at my birthday party for the first time. I've known him for 30 years. And after that, we decided to go into the studio together and work on a duet work. But we are experimenting, because he comes from contact improvisation and I come from another base altogether. When you go into the studio to experiment, you can say, okay, I'm going to work on pulse beat today, and I'm going to experiment. How can I slot in as many movements as possible over a pulse beat? And that's educating your body. That is not creating. So when you set yourself a task, remember, that's education. But when you go into the studio with a creative idea in your mind, you must not bring the experimental in with it. You must just go with your creative spirit. Does that clear it up for you?
That makes sense, yes.
Yes. I didn't know I knew that. It's wonderful when you sit down and talk with people, because they ask you questions and you didn't know that you knew the answer and you'd never thought about the answer, but then when you go in, you've got the answer back somewhere in your head, right? So thank you for asking me and not being able to answer my question.
You're welcome, then.
Yes,
it makes you want to look for words.
Yes, you just taught me something. And you know how I like learning things.
Indeed.
Matter of fact, I used to amuse the students sometimes, because they asked me, like, when did I decide that contemporary dance was what my life was all about? And I said, I've never decided. Just things have come over the horizon that have just caught my eye, and I have just done them. And that shocked them, because in society today you're supposed to decide, who you are and what you're going to do, etc., etc., etc. But I also told them that one day I'm going to say, I know what life is all about, and I'm going to croak. Because when I'm not learning, and when my curiosity is fulfilled, and when people don't interest me anymore, I'm out of here, because nothing will sustain me anymore.
But until then...
Until then...
Can we look forward to seeing a presentation of something of yours soon?
Well, I just called Michael Montanaro to get some free studio space at Concordia, which I think I deserve.
I think you're entitled,
And Peter Ryan and I were there yesterday, and we're there today and tomorrow. And Michael said, what do you want the studio for, Elizabeth? And I said, well, Peter Ryan and I are working on this duet. And he said, hey, will you perform it at Concordia? He's going to put my name down, our names down already. So maybe you will see it.
Brilliant.
But it's down the road. We need to spend a lot of time together.
Mm-hmm. Do you have other projects on the horizon?
Another one-woman show that I'm working on with my director in Australia, so I'll go back there. But that's enough.
Yes, fair.
Yes.
Wonderful. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show.
It's been a pleasure to be here, and I've learned some things.
Wonderful, and so have we.
And good luck to you, all of you, for everything you're doing.
Thank you so much. Dirty Feet is recorded every week at the Montreal Improv Theatre. Check them out at montrealimprov.com.
Dirty Feet is produced and hosted by
Alison Burns,
JD Papillon,
Joanie Farran,
and distributed by No More Radio.
You can find more about our show at nomoreradio.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Dirty Dirty Feet, and you can find us on Facebook at Dirty Feet Podcast.
Tune in next week for a whole new show.